The doors of the great hall swung open with a sound like a struck bell, and every head in the room turned at once. Alara Vance stood at the center of the marble floor, in a gown the color of fresh cream, her hands folded in front of her, her heart hammering so loudly, she was certain the nobles seated around her could hear it. Tonight was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Tonight, she was supposed to become the mate of Alpha Lord Garin Ashby, heir to one of the richest territories in the kingdom. Instead, she was standing alone at the front of the hall, while Garin remained seated at the high table, a cup of wine in his hand, his eyes fixed on someone else entirely. The whispers began almost immediately. Alara felt them prickling against her skin like 100 tiny needles. She kept her chin lifted, the way her mother had taught her, the way a lady of her house was supposed to stand no matter what storm was breaking around her. Garin. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The ceremony is ready to begin. He did not stand. He did not even look at her right away. When he finally turned his head, there was no warmth in his expression, only a kind of tired indifference, as if she were an appointment he had forgotten to cancel. "I cannot go through with this," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a woman laughed, quickly stifling it behind a gloved hand. Alara felt the blood drain from her face, but she did not move. She would not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already understood exactly what he meant. Garin rose from his seat at last, straightening his jacket, as though preparing for nothing more significant than an afternoon walk. Behind him, a young Omega woman named Priscilla Wynne sat with her eyes lowered, though the small, satisfied curve of her lips told Alara everything she needed to know. This had been planned, perhaps for weeks, perhaps for months. "You are a fine Omega, Alara," Garin said, as though offering her a compliment might soften the blow. "But you do not carry the bloodline my family requires. Priscilla's lineage is stronger. Her scent is more compatible with mine. I have made my decision, and my father agrees. The bloodline my family requires," as if she were livestock being evaluated for breeding, rather than a woman who had spent 2 years preparing for this exact night, learning the customs of his household, memorizing the names of his relatives, practicing the greetings of his court. "You could have told me this privately," she said quietly. "You did not need to humiliate me in front of the entire kingdom. Would it have mattered where I told you?" His voice was flat, almost bored. "The result is the same." Laughter broke out again, sharper this time, coming from a cluster of young nobles near the wine table. Alara recognized several of them from her childhood, girls she had once shared lessons with, boys who had once called her friend. Now they watched her unravel like a performance staged purely for their entertainment. She felt something inside her chest crack, quiet and final, like the first fracture forming in a pane of glass. "Fine," she said. Her voice did not shake. "Then I release you from any obligation to my family, and I ask that you release me from mine." A murmur of surprise moved through the hall. It seemed no one expected her to speak with such composure. Garin's eyebrows lifted slightly, as though her calm response was somehow more insulting than tears would have been. "Your family will still owe mine the return of the betrothal gifts," he said. "They will be returned within the week." She turned before he could say another word, before the tears building behind her eyes could betray her in front of these people, who had already decided she was beneath their notice. She walked the length of the great hall with her spine straight and her steps even, though every part of her wanted to run. Outside, the night air hit her like cold water, and she finally allowed herself to breathe. Her father was waiting by the carriage, his face pale with fury and shame. He said nothing as she climbed inside, and she was grateful for his silence. She did not think she could bear comfort right now. Comfort might break her completely. The ride home was long and quiet. Alara stared out the window at the passing hills, the moonlight silvering the grass, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 2 years of her life, gone in a single evening. Her reputation, gone with it. In their world, a rejected Omega carried a mark that never fully faded. No matter what she did afterward, people would always remember this night. They would always whisper about the girl who was cast aside in front of the whole court. By the time the carriage reached her family estate, her father had made his decision. "You will go to the countryside house," he said, finally breaking the silence. "The one near Millbrook. It will be quieter there. away from prying eyes and cruel tongues. Alara did not argue. She understood what he was really saying. He wanted her out of sight until the scandal faded, if it ever did. She could not blame him. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father had never quite learned how to offer comfort beyond solving problems in practical terms. Sending her away was, in his mind, an act of protection. "When do I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said. "The staff there are already expecting you." That night, Alara did not sleep. She sat by her window, watching the stars, replaying the humiliation over and over, until the edges of the memory blurred into something almost unreal, as though it had happened to someone else. She thought about Garen's cold expression, about the laughter of people she had once called friends, about the way an entire room full of nobles had watched her fall apart and found it entertaining. She promised herself something in the quiet hours before dawn. She would not let this destroy her. She would go to Millbrook, and she would build a life there, small and unremarkable perhaps, but hers. No one would ever again have the power to humiliate her so completely, because she would never again put herself in a position to be judged and found wanting. The journey to Millbrook took 2 full days by carriage. Alara watched the scenery change from the rolling farmland near the capital to thicker forests and narrower roads, the towns growing smaller and more scattered the farther they traveled. By the time the carriage rolled up the gravel path leading to the countryside estate, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. The house itself was modest compared to what she was used to, a 2-story stone building with ivy climbing one side, and a garden that had clearly been neglected for years. An older woman named Greta, the estate's housekeeper, met her at the door with a warm but cautious smile. "You must be Lady Alara," Greta said, taking her bags before Alara could protest. "We heard you would be staying with us for a while." Come in. You must be exhausted from the road." Alara managed a small smile in return. "Thank you, Greta. I think exhausted is the right word for many things right now." Greta gave her a knowing look, but did not press further. She led Alara through the house, pointing out the sitting room, the kitchen, the small library that had once belonged to Alara's grandmother. Everything smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but there was something comforting about it too, a sense of being far removed from the world that had just discarded her. "The staff here is small," Greta explained as they walked. "Myself, the cook, 2 maids, and old Ferris who handles the grounds, and of course, the boy in the stables." "The boy?" Alara asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. Greta's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "He came to us a few years back, wandered onto the property half-starved and covered in scars. No one knows where he came from. He does not speak, not a single word, not even a sound. We assumed he simply could not." "That's terrible," Alara said, feeling a small pang of sympathy despite her own troubles. "What is his name?" "He never gave us one, and he cannot tell us himself. The others just call him Boy, or sometimes Stable Hand, though I never much liked that. Ferris put him to work with the horses since he seemed to have a natural way with them. He keeps to himself mostly, doesn't cause any trouble." Alara nodded, filing the information away without much thought. She had enough of her own pain to carry, without adding someone else's tragedy to the pile. That night, she ate a quiet dinner, alone in the small dining room, the silence of the house pressing in around her, in a way that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the past few days. The next morning, she woke early, unable to sleep past dawn out of old habit. She dressed simply, without the elaborate layers and jewelry she used to wear in the capital, and decided to explore the grounds while the morning air was still cool. The garden, as she had suspected the evening before, was in a state of disarray. Weeds choked what had once been carefully tended flower beds, and the stone paths were cracked and overgrown with moss. She found herself oddly drawn to the challenge of it, the idea of restoring something broken back to a version of beauty, even if it was a small and insignificant thing in the grand scheme of the world. As she walked toward the far end of the garden, she noticed the stable for the first time, a long wooden building set slightly apart from the main house, its doors open to let in the morning light. She could hear the soft sounds of horses shifting inside, the creak of old wood, and beneath it, something else. A low rhythmic sound, almost like humming, except it carried no actual melody, just a strange, wordless breath moving through the air. Curious despite herself, Elara stepped closer. Inside the stable, she found a young man brushing down a chestnut mare with slow, careful strokes. He was tall, though slightly hunched, as though he had spent years trying to make himself smaller than he actually was. His clothes were worn and patched in several places, and even from a distance, she could see the faint white lines of old scars crossing his forearms, disappearing beneath his sleeves. He did not notice her at first, too absorbed in his work, murmuring that same wordless hum to the horse, as though it were a song only the two of them understood. There was something gentle in the way he moved, something careful and deliberate, as if the horse's comfort mattered more to him than anything else in the world. Elara stood in the doorway for a long moment, unwilling to interrupt whatever quiet ritual she had stumbled upon. But the mare noticed her before the young man did, turning her head toward the door and letting out a soft whinny. The young man froze instantly, his shoulders tensing as he spun around. When he saw Elara standing there, his eyes went wide, and he immediately dropped his gaze to the ground, taking a step back as though he expected to be struck. "I'm sorry," Elara said quickly, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was just exploring the grounds. I'm Elara. I'll be staying here for a while." He did not respond, though she had not expected him to, given what Greta had told her. He kept his eyes fixed on the straw-covered floor, his body rigid, as though bracing for something unpleasant. It struck her then how thin he was, how the tension in his frame seemed less like shyness and more like the learned response of someone who had been hurt too many times to trust a stranger's kindness. "You don't have to be afraid of me," she said softly. "I'm not here to cause you any trouble." Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his eyes just enough to look at her, and for a brief moment, Elara felt something strange pass between them, a flicker of recognition, though she could not have explained what exactly they recognized in each other. Perhaps it was simply the shared understanding of two people who had both been discarded by the world in different ways. "What's her name?" Elara asked, nodding toward the mare, trying to ease the tension in the room. The young man hesitated, then reached out and gently touched the horse's neck, his fingers moving in a way that almost looked like the beginning of a word, though no sound followed. Elara realized after a moment that he was showing her rather than telling her, using his hands to shape something in the air, a gesture she did not yet understand. "I don't know that language," she admitted, "but I would like to learn it, if you're willing to teach me." For the first time, something shifted in his expression, the rigid fear softening just slightly into something closer to surprise. No one, it seemed, had ever offered to meet him in his silence before. Everyone simply worked around it, or ignored him entirely, treating his inability to speak as a wall, rather than a language of its own. Elara stepped a little further into the stable, keeping her movements slow and unthreatening, the way she might approach a nervous animal. "I'm going to be here for a while," she said. "I don't know anyone in this house except Greta, and I imagine you don't have many people to talk to either, in whatever way you're able to talk. Would it be all right if I visited sometimes? I promise I won't bother you if you'd rather be alone." The young man studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face, as though trying to determine whether her kindness was genuine or simply another cruelty waiting to reveal itself. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, at least partially, because he gave a small, hesitant nod. It was such a small gesture, barely a movement at all, but Elara felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest, the first genuine comfort she had felt since the humiliation of 2 nights before. She did not know this young man's name, did not know where he came from, or what had happened to silence him so completely, but in that quiet stable, surrounded by the smell of hay and the soft breathing of horses, she felt, for the first time in days, that she was not entirely alone. "I'll bring you something from the kitchen tomorrow," she said, offering him a small smile before turning to leave. "Something better than whatever they're feeding you out here, I imagine." As she walked back toward the house, she glanced over her shoulder once and saw him still standing in the doorway of the stable, watching her go, his expression unreadable, but no longer quite so guarded. She did not know it then, standing in the golden light of that quiet morning, but the small kindness she had just offered a nameless, voiceless stranger would become the thread that quietly rewrote the entire course of her life. That evening, Elara sat by the window in her new room, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills, and found herself thinking not of Garen, not of the humiliation in the great hall, not even of the life she had lost, but of the young man in the stable, and the strange, wordless hum that had drawn her toward him in the first place. There was something about him that felt like a mystery worth solving, though she could not have said why, or perhaps she simply needed something outside of her own pain to focus on, something that made her feel useful again after feeling so thoroughly discarded. Whatever the reason, she found herself looking forward to morning in a way she had not expected, and for the first time since the disaster of her betrothal ceremony, she fell asleep, without replaying the humiliation in her mind. Instead, she dreamed of gray eyes and gentle hands moving through the air, shaping words that had no sound but somehow still managed to say something important. The next morning, Ilara kept her promise. She woke before the rest of the house stirred, slipped into the kitchen while the cook was still lighting the ovens, and wrapped a portion of fresh bread, a bit of cheese, and a small jar of honey into a cloth. Greta caught her on the way out and raised an eyebrow at the bundle in her hands. "Taking breakfast to the stable boy, are we?" Greta asked, though there was no judgment in her tone, only mild curiosity. "He looked thin," Ilara said simply. "And no one should have to eat alone every single day." Greta's expression softened. "That's kind of you, my lady. Ferris feeds him, but I don't think anyone's ever thought to sit with him. Most folks find his silence uncomfortable. They talk around him like he isn't there." The words settled uncomfortably in Ilara's chest as she made her way across the dew-covered grass toward the stable. She understood, in a way she had not fully considered before, what it meant to be looked past, to be present in a room, and yet treated as though invisible. She had felt something similar in the Great Hall 2 nights ago, though her invisibility had been a choice made by someone who wanted to hurt her, while his seemed to be simply the careless indifference of people too busy to notice. She found him already awake, mucking out one of the stalls with steady, practiced movements. He noticed her before she said anything this time, his body tensing briefly before he recognized her face, and some of the tension eased from his shoulders. It was a small thing, but Ilara noticed it, and it pleased her more than she expected. "Good morning," she said, holding up the cloth bundle. "I brought breakfast. I hope you like honey." He set down the pitchfork and wiped his hands on his trousers, watching her with cautious curiosity, as she found a low wooden bench near the stable entrance and unwrapped the bread. She broke off a piece and held it out to him. For a long moment, he simply stared at her outstretched hand, as though trying to determine whether this was some kind of test he might fail. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and accepted the bread, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest instant before he pulled back, sitting down at the far end of the bench, keeping a careful distance between them. They ate in silence for a while, the horses shifting and snorting softly in their stalls, the morning light slanting through the open doors in long golden beams. Ilara did not try to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter, sensing that he would appreciate the quiet more than forced conversation. Instead, she simply enjoyed the peace of the moment, the first calm morning she had experienced in longer than she could remember. "I never got your name yesterday," she said eventually, keeping her voice light. "Well, I suppose you couldn't have given it to me even if you wanted to. Do you have a way of writing it down, perhaps?" He shook his head, and something flickered across his face, an expression that looked almost like shame, though Ilara could not be certain. She wondered if he had never been taught to read or write, or if there was some other reason behind his hesitation.
"That's all right,"
she said gently, sensing she had touched on something sensitive.
"Then I suppose I'll have to give you one myself, unless you'd rather I didn't."
He looked at her with open curiosity now, waiting. Ilara studied him for a moment, taking in the gray of his eyes, pale and quiet like the color of ash after a fire has burned itself out, leaving behind something calm and steady in its place. "Ash," she said finally. "I think Ash suits you. Would that be all right?" He considered the name for a long moment, turning it over in his mind, and then he nodded, a small but genuine smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time since she had met him. It transformed his entire face, softening the guarded lines around his eyes, and Ilara felt an unexpected rush of warmth at having been the one to put it there. "Ash it is then," she said, smiling back at him. From that morning onward, a quiet routine began to form between them. Ilara would rise early, gather a small breakfast from the kitchen, and bring it to the stable before the rest of the household was fully awake. Ash would set aside whatever task he was working on, and they would sit together on the same low bench, sharing food in comfortable silence, occasionally broken by Alara's gentle attempts at conversation. She learned quickly that Ash understood everything she said perfectly well, despite his inability to respond with words. He would nod or shake his head, point at things, or use small gestures to communicate simple thoughts. Over the following weeks, Alara began teaching him some of the hand signs she remembered from a tutor who had once worked with a deaf relative of her mother's. Simple words at first: food, water, horse, thank you, and slowly building toward more complex ideas. Ash absorbed the lessons with a hunger that surprised her, his hands quick to mimic each new sign, his eyes bright with something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been waiting his entire life for someone to finally offer him a way to speak, even if it was only with his hands. One afternoon, several weeks into her stay, Alara found him sitting outside the stable during a rare break, sketching something in the dirt with a stick. She approached quietly and saw that he had drawn a rough shape, a horse mid-gallop, its mane flying, captured with a surprising amount of skill despite the crude medium. "That's wonderful," she said, genuinely impressed. "You're quite talented." He looked up at her, startled, then quickly moved to smudge the drawing away with his boot, as though embarrassed to have been caught. "No, don't," Alara said quickly, reaching out to stop him. "I meant it. You should draw more. Perhaps not just in the dirt, though. Wait here." She hurried back to the house and returned a short while later with a small notebook and a stub of charcoal she had found in her grandmother's old library. She handed them to Ash, who stared at the items in his hands, as though he had been given something precious beyond measure. "For you," she said, "so you can draw whenever you like, and so you have something more permanent than dirt to keep your pictures on." Ash ran his fingers over the cover of the notebook, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were unmistakably damp, though he blinked quickly, as if trying to hide it. He reached out and, for the first time since she had known him, gently touched her hand, a brief gesture of gratitude that carried more meaning than any words could have expressed. As the weeks passed, Alara found herself growing genuinely fond of her quiet companion. She told him about her life before Millbrook, about the ceremony that had ended in humiliation, about the friends who had turned into strangers overnight, about the strange, hollow loneliness of being cast aside by the very people who had once claimed to care for her. Ash listened to everything with quiet attention, his expression shifting between sympathy and something that looked almost like quiet anger on her behalf, though he could never voice it aloud. In turn, though Ash could not tell her his own story in words, he began sharing pieces of himself through his drawings. She would find sketches of forests, of tall stone towers, of strange symbols she did not recognize, images that hinted at a past far more complicated than a simple stable boy who had wandered onto the estate one day. Alara noticed these things but chose not to press him, sensing that whatever had happened to silence him so completely was a wound too deep to be reopened by casual curiosity. She simply continued showing up, morning after morning, offering companionship without demanding explanations, and slowly, she watched Ash begin to change. His shoulders, once perpetually hunched as though bracing for a blow, began to straighten. His eyes, once guarded and downcast, began to meet hers more readily, more openly. He still could not speak, but in every other way, it seemed to Alara that he was slowly finding his voice again, one small gesture at a time. One evening, as autumn began to color the leaves around the estate in shades of gold and amber, Alara sat with Ash near the stable as the sun set, watching the horses graze in the distance. She had brought a small lantern to ward off the evening chill, and in its soft glow, she noticed Ash watching her with an expression she could not quite name. "What is it?" she asked, smiling slightly. He hesitated, then reached for his notebook and quickly sketched something, turning it toward her when he finished. It was a simple drawing, two figures sitting together beneath a tree, nothing elaborate, but there was warmth in the way he had drawn it, a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have. "Is that us?" Alara asked softly. Ash nodded, his cheeks coloring slightly, and Alara felt her own heart warm in response. Whatever pain had brought this silent young man to her doorstep, whatever mystery still lingered behind his gray eyes, she found that she no longer cared to solve it out of mere curiosity. She simply wanted to continue sitting beside him, evening after evening, watching him slowly bloom back into himself. She did not yet understand the depth of what she was witnessing, did not yet know that the careful, gentle patience she offered so freely was slowly healing wounds far older and far deeper than she could have imagined. She only knew that for the first time since her humiliation in the Great Hall, she felt genuinely happy, and that happiness had come from the most unexpected place imaginable: a quiet stable, a nameless boy, and the simple, powerful act of choosing kindness over indifference. As the days grew shorter and the first chill of winter crept into the air, Ilara realized she had stopped counting the days since her rejection. She had stopped waiting for a letter of apology that would never come, stopped wondering what the nobles in the capital were saying about her now. Instead, her days had filled with something far more meaningful: the slow, careful building of a friendship that asked for nothing and gave everything, one quiet morning at a time. Winter arrived at Millbrook with a sharpness that surprised Ilara, the countryside air far colder than anything she had known in the capital. Snow blanketed the fields within the first week of the season, and the estate settled into a quieter rhythm, the household gathering closer around the fireplaces while the wind howled outside the windows. Ilara did not let the cold stop her morning visits to the stable. If anything, she found herself more determined than ever, bundling herself in a thick wool cloak and carrying warm tea alongside the usual bread and cheese. Ash always seemed surprised anew each morning that she still came, as though some part of him expected her kindness to run out eventually, the way so many other things in his life apparently had. "You look surprised every single day," she teased him one frosty morning, handing him a steaming cup of tea. "Did you think I would simply stop coming because the weather turned cold?" He shook his head, but the small, sheepish smile that followed told her she had guessed correctly. She had learned, over the past months, to read the subtle language of his expressions almost as fluently as she had learned his hand signs, and she found a strange comfort in how well she now understood him without a single spoken word passing between them. By this point, their lessons had progressed considerably. Ash could now communicate fairly complex thoughts using the signs Ilara had taught him, supplemented by his own quick sketches whenever words alone were not enough. He had also begun teaching her some of his own older signs, gestures he must have learned somewhere before arriving at the estate, though he still would not, or could not, explain their origin. One particular afternoon, while helping him groom a stubborn gelding, Ilara noticed something odd. Ash moved with an unusual precision when handling the horse, adjusting the animal's stance with a firm, confident hand that seemed almost trained, rather than simply learned through years of stable work. When the horse shifted uncomfortably, Ash corrected its posture with a technique she recognized from watching cavalry officers train in the capital, a method typically reserved for war horses rather than farm animals. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, genuinely curious. Ash froze for a moment, his hand still resting on the horse's flank, and something like panic flickered briefly across his face before he composed himself. He shook his head quickly, indicating he did not know, or perhaps that he did not wish to say, and returned his attention to the grooming without meeting her eyes. Ilara did not press the matter, though she filed the small mystery away, alongside the others she had collected over the months, the strange symbols in his sketches, the tension that gripped him whenever travelers passed near the estate, the way he sometimes flinched at loud, sudden noises, as though bracing for danger that never came. She had come to accept that Ash carried a past he either could not or would not share, and she respected that boundary, even as her curiosity occasionally tugged at her. As winter deepened, Ilara found other ways to occupy her time beyond her visits to the stable. She began restoring the neglected garden behind the house, spending her afternoons clearing away dead weeds and planning what she might plant when spring finally arrived. Greta often joined her for these sessions, the two women developing an easy friendship over shared cups of tea and quiet conversation. "You've changed since you arrived," Greta observed one afternoon, as they sat together in the kitchen, warming their hands by the fire. "When you first came, you looked like someone carrying the weight of the whole world on her shoulders. Now you laugh more. You smile more." Ilara considered the observation for a moment before answering. "I suppose I have changed. Being here, away from all the noise and judgment of the capital, has given me space to remember who I actually am, rather than who everyone else expected me to be." "And the stable boy has something to do with that, I imagine," Greta said, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she was not entirely sure why. "Ash has become a good friend," she said carefully. He listens without judgment. That's more than I can say for most of the people I knew in the capital. Greta chuckled softly, but did not push the matter further, though the knowing look in her eyes suggested she saw something in the situation that Elara herself was not yet ready to acknowledge. As the winter months wore on, Elara's friendship with Ash continued to deepen in small, meaningful ways. She began noticing things about him that went beyond his silence, the careful, methodical way he approached every task, the quiet dignity he carried despite his low position in the household, the fierce protectiveness he displayed toward the horses in his care, treating each one as though its well-being mattered more than his own comfort. One particularly harsh evening, when a sudden storm blew in from the mountains, Elara ventured out to the stable to check on him, worried the old wooden building might not hold against the fierce wind. She found him already awake despite the late hour, moving calmly between the stalls, speaking to the frightened horses in his wordless, humming way, the same gentle sound she had heard on her very first visit months ago. "Is everything all right?" she asked, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the storm. Ash nodded, gesturing for her to come further inside, away from the worst of the wind. He guided her to a quiet corner near a lantern he had lit, and together they sat and waited out the storm, listening to the wind howl and the horses gradually settle under his calming influence. In the flickering lantern light, Elara studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his gray eyes as he watched over the animals in his care. She realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that she had begun to feel something for him that went beyond simple friendship, something warmer and more complicated, though she was not yet ready to examine it too closely. When the storm finally passed and dawn began to break over the horizon, Ash walked her back to the main house, their hands brushing together in the cold morning air. At the door, he paused, reaching into his coat and producing a small folded piece of paper from his notebook. He handed it to her with an expression of quiet uncertainty, as though unsure how she might receive it. Elara unfolded the paper carefully and found a detailed drawing of herself, sitting on the same low bench where they shared breakfast every morning, her expression soft and peaceful, captured with a tenderness that took her breath away. Beneath the drawing, in careful, if slightly uneven handwriting, he had written a single word: friend. "Ash," she whispered, looking up at him with tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "This is beautiful. Thank you." He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender and unexpected that Elara felt her breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the pale morning light, neither one moving, the space between them charged with something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. Then, seeming to catch himself, Ash stepped back, his cheeks coloring, and offered her a small, apologetic bow, before turning and heading back toward the stable, leaving Elara standing alone at the door, her heart racing in a way it had not raced in a very long time. She spent the rest of that day in a strange, distracted haze, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She had come to Millbrook broken and humiliated, expecting nothing more from her exile than quiet solitude and the slow healing of old wounds. She had not expected to find something like this, a connection so pure and unguarded that it frightened her slightly, precisely because it felt so different from anything she had experienced before. That evening, she returned to the stable earlier than usual, unable to stay away, despite her own uncertainty about what had passed between them that morning. She found Ash waiting for her, seated on their usual bench, his notebook open on his lap. When he saw her approaching, he set the notebook aside and rose to meet her, his expression a careful mixture of hope and nervousness. "I've been thinking about this morning," Elara said, her voice softer than she intended. "About the drawing, about the word you wrote." Ash watched her carefully, waiting, his hands still at his sides, though she could see the slight tremor in them, the effort it took him to remain patient, rather than reach for his notebook to explain himself in the only way he could. "I think," Elara continued slowly, choosing her words with care, "that friend might not be entirely accurate anymore, not for how I feel at least." Something shifted in Ash's expression, hope blooming openly across his face now, unguarded in a way she had never seen before. He reached for her hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, neither of them pulled away. They stood together in the fading evening light, two people who had both been discarded by the world in their own ways, finding in each other something neither had expected to find again, a quiet, patient kind of love that asked for nothing beyond honesty and presence. Elara did not know, in that peaceful moment, how much more complicated their story would soon become, or how the quiet stable boy standing before her carried secrets that would eventually shake the entire kingdom. She only knew that for the first time since the humiliation that had brought her to Millbrook, she felt completely, unreservedly happy, and she was not willing to let that feeling go without a fight. As winter began its slow surrender to the first hints of spring, their bond deepened further still. Elara spent nearly every free hour in Ash's company, whether helping him with the horses, sharing quiet meals on their bench, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence while he sketched and she read from her grandmother's old books. The household staff noticed, of course, exchanging knowing glances and soft smiles whenever the two of them were together, though no one spoke of it openly, respecting the fragile, precious thing that was clearly growing between them. Elara's father sent occasional letters from the capital, brief and formal, asking after her well-being without any real warmth behind the words. She answered them dutifully, but found herself no longer longing for the life she had left behind. The capital, with its cold ceremonies and crueler people, felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the simple, genuine happiness she had found in this quiet corner of the countryside, beside a man who could not speak a single word, but somehow managed to say everything that mattered most. Spring came to Millbrook slowly, the frost retreating from the fields in patches, the first green shoots pushing through soil that had been frozen solid for months. Elara's garden, once a tangle of dead weeds, began to show signs of life under her careful attention, and she found a quiet satisfaction in watching something she had nurtured finally begin to flourish. Her relationship with Ash had settled into something steady and warm over the following months, though they remained careful about how openly they showed their affection in front of the rest of the household. It was not that either of them felt ashamed, but rather that they both understood the precarious nature of their situation. Elara was still, technically, a noblewoman, even a disgraced one, and Ash was a stable hand, with no name, no history, and no standing whatsoever in their rigid society. Whispers had already begun among the staff, and Elara worried what her father might say if word reached the capital that his exiled daughter had fallen for a servant. But in the quiet moments they shared, away from prying eyes, none of that seemed to matter. Ash had grown remarkably skilled at expressing himself through their combination of signs, sketches, and simple written notes, and Elara found herself continually surprised by the depth of thought and feeling hidden behind his silence. He noticed things others missed, small kindnesses, subtle emotions, the way a person's shoulders might tense before they spoke a lie. He was, she often thought, one of the most perceptive people she had ever known, silence having sharpened his other senses in ways speech might never have allowed. One warm afternoon in early spring, Elara decided to venture further from the estate than she usually did, curious to see more of the surrounding countryside now that the weather had turned pleasant. She invited Ash to accompany her, and though he hesitated briefly, glancing toward the road that led toward the nearest town with an expression she could not quite decipher, he eventually agreed. They walked together along a winding path that led through a small forest bordering the estate, the afternoon sun filtering through new spring leaves in dappled patterns of light and shadow. Ash seemed more relaxed than usual, occasionally pausing to point out interesting plants or animal tracks, his hands moving fluidly through the signs they had developed together over the past months. As they emerged from the forest into a small clearing, they came upon a group of travelers resting beside the road, their horses grazing nearby while they shared a midday meal. Elara thought nothing of it at first, simply a common sight along any well-traveled route, but she noticed Ash's entire demeanor change instantly. His body went rigid, his breathing quickened, and he immediately stepped slightly behind her, as though trying to make himself less visible. "Ash?" she asked quietly, concerned by the sudden shift. "What's wrong?" He shook his head quickly, gesturing for them to turn back the way they had come, his eyes never leaving the group of travelers, though he kept his face carefully angled away from them. Elara glanced toward the strangers and noticed for the first time the emblem stitched onto their travel cloaks, a stylized flame surrounded by a circle of stars, a symbol she vaguely recognized from her studies of kingdom heraldry but could not immediately place. They turned back toward the estate without another word, Ash's pace quick and purposeful, his hand finding hers and holding it tightly, as though he needed the reassurance of her presence to steady himself. It was not until they were safely back within the boundaries of the estate that his tension finally began to ease, though Alara noticed he remained unusually quiet for the rest of the afternoon, more withdrawn than she had seen him in months. That evening, as they sat together near the stable, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Alara gently broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind since the encounter. "You seemed frightened earlier," she said carefully. "By those travelers, do you know them somehow?" Ash's hands stilled in his lap, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the ground, his expression conflicted, as though wrestling with some internal struggle he could not fully articulate, even with the tools they had built together. Finally, he shook his head, though the gesture felt less like a denial and more like an admission that he simply did not know how to explain what he was feeling. "You don't have to tell me," Alara said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I just want you to know that whatever it is, whatever happened to you before you came here, you're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." Ash looked up at her then, his gray eyes shining with an emotion so raw and vulnerable that it nearly took her breath away. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a silent expression of gratitude that spoke louder than any words could have managed. Over the following weeks, Alara noticed subtle changes in Ash's behavior that she might have missed had she not grown so attuned to his moods. He seemed more watchful than before, occasionally glancing toward the road that led away from the estate with an expression of quiet unease. He also began sleeping less soundly, according to Ferris, who mentioned in passing that he sometimes heard the young man moving restlessly in the small room above the stable where he slept. Alara worried about him, though she was careful not to press too hard, understanding intuitively that whatever haunted him needed to be approached with patience rather than force. Instead, she simply made herself a steady, constant presence in his life, offering comfort through her continued companionship rather than demanding explanations he was not yet ready to give. One evening, as they sat together reading through one of her grandmother's old books, Ash suddenly set down the pages he had been looking over and reached for his notebook. He wrote something slowly, his hand steady despite the evident difficulty of what he was trying to express, and then turned the notebook toward her. "I was someone else once," the note read. "Something bad happened. I do not remember all of it, but I remember being afraid, and I remember running. I stopped here because I could not run anymore." Alara read the words several times, her heart aching for the pain behind them, the fragmented, incomplete nature of the memory, suggesting some kind of trauma so severe it had fractured his very sense of self. She reached out and gently took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "You don't have to remember everything right now, or ever, if that's what's easier. I care about who you are today, not who you might have been before." Ash's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace, resting his chin atop her head as they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of his partial confession settling between them like something sacred, too fragile to be examined too closely just yet. Alara did not push for more details after that evening, though she found herself thinking more often about the mystery of his past, wondering what could have been so traumatic that it stole his voice entirely and left him running from something he could not even fully remember. She noticed, too, that his fear of the traveling emblem seemed connected somehow to whatever he had fled from, though she could not begin to guess the full shape of the puzzle. As spring gave way to early summer, life at Millbrook settled into a peaceful rhythm once more, the earlier tension gradually fading as no further travelers passed too closely to the estate. Alara's garden bloomed fully for the first time since her arrival, filling the air with the sweet scent of roses and lavender, and she often brought fresh flowers to decorate the stable, much to Ash's quiet delight. Their relationship continued to deepen during these warmer months, the careful affection they had built over the winter, blossoming into something neither of them tried to hide any longer, at least not from each other. Greta had taken to leaving them alone during the evenings, offering a knowing smile whenever she noticed them slipping away together after dinner, and even Ferris, gruff as he normally was, seemed to soften slightly whenever he observed the young couple together. Yet beneath the surface peace of those summer months, Alara sometimes noticed Ash's eyes drift toward the horizon, a distant, thoughtful expression crossing his face, as though some part of him remained tethered to a past he could not fully escape, no matter how much happiness he found in his present. She did not know it then, watching him from across the garden as he worked among the horses. But the quiet peace they had built together at Millbrook was destined to be tested far sooner than either of them could have anticipated, and the shadows of Ash's forgotten past were already beginning to stir, drawing steadily closer with each passing season. Word arrived at Millbrook on a hot summer morning, carried by a traveling merchant who stopped at the estate to sell fine cloth and exchange news from the capital. Ilara was in the kitchen with Greta when the merchant's voice drifted in from the front hall, and something in his tone, urgent and hushed, made her set down her cup of tea and listen more closely. "They say the throne has stood empty for nearly 5 years now," the merchant was saying to one of the maids, who had paused her chores to listen. "The old king dead. His heir vanished the very same night, and no one able to say for certain whether the young man is alive or lost forever. The council rules in his place, but everyone knows a council cannot hold a kingdom together the way a true alpha king can." Ilara stepped into the hallway, curiosity pulling her toward the conversation despite her general disinterest in the political affairs of the capital since her exile. "Forgive my interruption," she said, "but did you say the heir vanished? I had not heard such news before coming here." The merchant turned to her, apparently recognizing quality in her bearing, despite her modest countryside dress, and offered a respectful bow. "Indeed, my lady. It happened during an attack on the royal procession, some years back now. Assassins, it said, though no one has ever confirmed who sent them or why. The old king was killed in the chaos, along with most of his personal guard. His son, the young prince, simply disappeared. Some say he died too, his body lost or destroyed beyond recognition. Others believe he survived and is hiding somewhere, too frightened or too broken to reclaim his birthright. And no one has searched for him?" Ilara asked, genuinely curious now. "Oh, they searched, my lady, for years. Search parties combed every corner of the kingdom in the months after the attack. But eventually, hope faded, and the council settled into ruling in his stead. Lately, though, there's been renewed talk of the search, whispers that certain nobles believe the prince may still be alive, hiding somewhere far from the capital, perhaps even living an entirely ordinary life, without any memory of who he truly is." Ilara felt a strange, uneasy prickle along her spine at those last words, though she could not immediately place why. She thanked the merchant for the information and returned to her tea, though her mind remained distracted for the rest of the morning, turning the conversation over and over without quite understanding what unsettled her so deeply about it. It was not until later that afternoon, watching Ash work with the horses from her usual spot on their bench, that the pieces began to shift uncomfortably into place. She thought of his unexplained fear at the sight of that traveling emblem months earlier, the flame surrounded by stars, a symbol she now recalled seeing depicted in old books as a variation of the royal crest, modified slightly for use by certain noble houses loyal to the crown. She thought of his fragmented confession, the vague memory of running from something terrible, the complete erasure of his voice and his past. She thought of the strange, trained precision he sometimes displayed when handling the horses, movements that seemed less like farm work and more like the disciplined habits of someone raised around soldiers, or perhaps around a royal guard. She pushed the thought away almost as soon as it formed, telling herself she was simply letting her imagination run wild after hearing an interesting piece of gossip. Ash was a quiet, gentle stable hand who had wandered onto the estate half-starved and traumatized. He was not some lost prince hiding in plain sight. The idea seemed almost absurd when she considered it directly, the kind of fanciful story one might find in the pages of a children's book rather than reality. And yet, the thought lingered, refusing to be fully dismissed. Over the following weeks, more news trickled into Millbrook through passing travelers and merchants, each piece adding a bit more detail to the growing rumor. Some said the missing prince had been marked by dark magic during the attack, a curse that had stolen his voice and scattered his memories as punishment for surviving when he should have died alongside his father. Others claimed the assassins had been hired by a rival noble house seeking to claim the throne for themselves, and that the search for the prince had recently intensified because that same house was growing bold enough to make an open claim to power, believing the true heir long dead. Ilara found herself listening more closely to each new rumor than she probably should have, always searching for details that might confirm or deny the uneasy suspicion growing in the back of her mind. She noticed, too, that whenever such news reached the estate, Ash grew subtly more withdrawn, his eyes distant, his hands occasionally trembling as he worked. though he never offered any explanation, and she never directly asked. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky, Alara finally worked up the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. "Ash," she said carefully, "there's been talk in the village, and among the travelers passing through. About the missing prince, about the throne sitting empty all these years." Ash's entire body went still beside her, his breathing suddenly shallow, though he did not look at her, his eyes fixed instead on some distant point beyond the horizon. "I don't want to frighten you," she continued gently, "and I'm not asking you to tell me anything you're not ready to share. But I have to ask, because I care about you too much not to. Does any of this mean something to you? The stories about the prince? The attack? The missing heir?" For a long moment, Ash said nothing, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his jaw working as though he were fighting against something buried deep inside himself, something that wanted desperately to surface but could not quite break free. Finally he reached for his notebook, his hand shaking slightly as he began to write. "I don't know," the note read. "I have dreams sometimes. A crown, a hall full of screaming, fire, a man's voice telling me to run and not look back. I don't know if they are memories or nightmares. I have never been able to tell the difference." Alara read the words with a growing sense of dread settling in her stomach, the pieces of the puzzle arranging themselves into a shape she was no longer able to ignore, no matter how much she wished she could. She looked up at Ash, at the quiet anguish written so clearly across his face, and felt her heart break for him all over again, this time for a reason far larger and more terrifying than she had initially imagined. "Whatever the truth is," she said softly, taking his hand in both of hers, "I promise you, I am not going anywhere. If you are simply Ash, the stable hand I fell in love with, then that is more than enough for me. And if you are something more, something the whole kingdom is searching for, then I will stand beside you through whatever comes next. I am not afraid of the truth, Ash. I am only afraid of losing you, whoever you turn out to be." Ash turned to her then, his gray eyes brimming with tears, and pulled her into a tight embrace, his entire body trembling as he held on to her, as though she were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly become far more uncertain than either of them had realized. They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the darkening sky, neither one speaking, neither one needing to, as the weight of an unspoken truth settled quietly between them, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally have to be revealed. Alara did not sleep well that night, her mind racing through the implications of what she now suspected, though she was careful not to let her fear show whenever Ash was near. She told herself that even if her suspicions were true, even if the gentle, silent man she had grown to love really was the lost heir to the kingdom's throne, it changed nothing about who he was as a person, the kindness in his heart, the gentle way he cared for every creature under his protection, the quiet strength he had shown in rebuilding himself from whatever trauma had shattered him in the first place. But she also understood, with a growing sense of unease, that the peaceful, hidden life they had built together at Millbrook could not last forever. If the kingdom truly believed its missing prince might still be alive, if certain ambitious nobles were growing bold enough to seize power in his continued absence, then it was only a matter of time before someone came looking in earnest, and Alara feared, with an intensity that surprised her, what that search might mean for the fragile peace she and Ash had built together, one quiet morning at a time. As the summer stretched on, that fear settled into a constant low hum beneath the surface of their daily routine, an unspoken tension that neither of them addressed directly, but that both of them felt keenly, growing stronger with every new rumor that drifted into Millbrook from the wider world beyond its quiet borders. The attack came without warning, on a night that had started out as peacefully as any other. Alara had stayed later than usual at the stable that evening, helping Ash settle a young foal that had been born just days earlier, the small creature still unsteady on its legs but curious about everything around it. They had laughed together, in their own quiet way, at the foal's clumsy attempts to nuzzle against its mother, and for a few precious hours, the growing tension of recent weeks had faded into the background, replaced by simple, uncomplicated joy. It was Ferris who first raised the alarm, his voice cutting through the night air with a sharpness that sent ice through Alara's veins. Riders on the road, armed men, moving fast toward the house. Ash was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting in a way Alara had never witnessed before. The gentle, careful movements he always used around the horses vanished, replaced by something sharp and alert, his gray eyes scanning the darkness beyond the stable doors, with the focused intensity of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of danger. "Ash, what's happening?" Ilara asked, fear creeping into her voice as the sound of approaching hooves grew louder. He did not answer with signs or gestures this time. Instead, he grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the stable, positioning her behind a stack of hay bales before moving to the doorway himself, his body tense and coiled like a spring ready to release. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, Ilara could see torchlight flickering across the yard as a group of armed riders thundered up the path toward the main house. Greta's voice rang out from somewhere near the front door, sharp with alarm, quickly followed by shouts and the unmistakable clash of steel against steel. "We have to help them," Ilara whispered urgently, moving to step past Ash toward the stable entrance. He caught her arm, shaking his head firmly, his expression pleading with her to stay hidden. But before either of them could decide on their next move, 3 of the armed men broke away from the main confrontation and turned their horses toward the stable, clearly having spotted movement near the entrance. "There! Someone's hiding in there!" one of the riders shouted, dismounting quickly and drawing a sword as he approached. Ilara's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. She had never witnessed real combat before, had only heard stories of battles fought in distant wars, and the reality of it, the harsh clang of metal, the shouted threats, the very real possibility of violence unfolding just steps away from her, left her frozen with terror. Ash, however, moved with a calm, deadly precision that stole the breath from her lungs. As the first attacker burst through the stable doors, sword raised, Ash sidestepped the strike with fluid grace, using the man's own momentum against him to send him crashing into a stack of wooden crates. A second attacker lunged forward, and Ash caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting sharply until the man cried out and dropped his weapon, which Ash immediately caught and turned against him, disarming the third attacker with a series of movements so quick and so perfectly executed that Ilara could barely follow them with her eyes. Within moments, all 3 attackers lay incapacitated on the stable floor, groaning in pain but very much alive, Ash having clearly chosen restraint over lethal force despite the obvious danger they had posed. He stood over them, breathing hard, his hands trembling slightly now that the immediate threat had passed, as though the violence had cost him something deep and painful to access. Ilara stared at him in stunned silence, the pieces of her earlier suspicions crashing together with undeniable force. No simple stable hand could have moved with such trained, disciplined skill. What she had just witnessed was the fighting technique of someone raised among soldiers, someone taught to defend himself and others with lethal efficiency, someone who had clearly suppressed this training for years, hiding it beneath the gentle, quiet persona he had built at Millbrook. Before either of them could process what had just happened, more shouts erupted from outside, followed by the sound of retreating hoofbeats. Moments later, Ferris burst into the stable, his face pale, and his arm bleeding from a shallow cut. "The attackers are fleeing," he gasped. "Greta drove them off with the household guard, though we lost 2 good men in the fighting. Are you both all right?" Ilara nodded numbly, still staring at Ash, who had turned away slightly, refusing to meet her eyes, clearly ashamed or afraid of what she must now think of him. "Ash saved us," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "He fought them off." Ferris's eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene, the 3 incapacitated attackers groaning on the stable floor, but he said nothing further, simply nodding and hurrying back toward the house to help tend to the wounded and secure the property against any further threat. Once they were alone again, Ilara slowly approached Ash, who remained rigid and unmoving, his back to her, his shoulders tense with what she now recognized as fear, not of the attackers, but of her reaction to what he had just revealed about himself. "Ash," she said softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Look at me." He turned slowly, his gray eyes filled with such raw vulnerability that it broke her heart all over again. He lifted his hands, beginning to sign an apology, an explanation, something desperate and fragmented, but Ilara stopped him gently, taking both of his hands in hers. "You just saved my life," she said firmly, "and the lives of everyone in that house. Whatever training allowed you to do that, Whatever past you're still trying to remember, none of it changes how grateful I am that you were here tonight." Ash's composure finally broke, and he pulled her into a desperate embrace, his body shaking, as the adrenaline of the fight gave way to something far more overwhelming, an emotional collapse that had clearly been building for years, held back only by the careful, controlled silence he had maintained since arriving at Millbrook. As dawn began to break over the estate, the household slowly began assessing the damage from the attack. 2 guards had been wounded but would survive, and remarkably, no one had been killed, thanks in large part to the swift intervention Ash had provided at the stable. The 3 attackers Ash had subdued were bound and held for questioning, though they remained stubbornly silent about who had sent them or why they had targeted the estate. Ilara's father arrived within 2 days of receiving urgent word of the attack, his face etched with worry as he rushed to confirm his daughter's safety. He questioned the captured attackers extensively, but they revealed nothing useful, seeming more frightened of whoever had hired them than of any punishment Ilara's father might impose. It was during this chaotic aftermath that fate intervened in a way none of them could have anticipated. Ash, exhausted and wounded from a cut he had sustained during the fight but had not mentioned to anyone, collapsed suddenly in the stable that evening, his fever spiking dangerously as an untreated wound became infected. Ilara stayed by his side throughout the night, applying cool compresses to his burning forehead and desperately trying to bring down his fever, terrified of losing him after everything they had survived together. As his condition worsened, he began murmuring in his sleep, fragmented words and phrases escaping his lips for the first time in years, though they made little sense to Ilara's exhausted, frightened mind. It was old Ferris, hovering nearby with a tray of medicine and bandages, who first noticed something deeply significant about Ash's delirious murmurs. "My lady," Ferris said slowly, his weathered face pale with shock, "do you hear what he's saying?" Ilara leaned closer, straining to make out the fevered words, and felt a chill run through her entire body as she finally understood. Ash was speaking, actual words forming from his lips for the first time since anyone at Millbrook had known him, but the language was unfamiliar, ancient and formal, unlike anything spoken in common use throughout the kingdom. "What language is that?" Ilara whispered, fear and hope warring within her chest in equal measure. Ferris shook his head slowly, backing away toward the door. "I don't know for certain, my lady, but I've heard old soldiers speak of it before, in hushed voices, always with great reverence. That is the ancient royal tongue, the sacred language once used exclusively by the Alpha royal bloodline, for ceremonies and private communication. No common person would know how to speak it, not even a single word, let alone entire sentences." Ilara stared down at Ash's fevered, restless face. The pieces of the puzzle she had been slowly assembling for months, finally crashing together into a picture so enormous and so impossible that she could hardly breathe. The quiet, gentle stable hand she had fallen in love with, the man who had wandered onto her family's estate half-starved and voiceless, the same man who had just demonstrated combat skills fit for a trained soldier, was now speaking words in a language reserved solely for the royal bloodline of the entire kingdom. "Fetch a healer," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Immediately. And Ferris, please, say nothing of what you just heard to anyone else. Not yet. Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." Ferris nodded gravely and hurried off to do as she asked, leaving Ilara alone once more with Ash, watching over him through the long, uncertain hours of the night, her mind racing with implications too enormous to fully comprehend. Whatever truth was about to emerge from this fevered crisis, she understood instinctively that nothing about their quiet, peaceful life at Millbrook would ever be the same again. The healer arrived just before dawn, an elderly woman named Odessa who had served the region for over 30 years, and had seen more strange ailments than she could easily count. She examined Ash's wound first, cleaning and treating the infection with practiced efficiency, before turning her attention to his continued feverish murmuring. Ilara watched anxiously as Odessa leaned close, listening carefully to the fragmented words still escaping Ash's lips, her weathered face growing increasingly pale and troubled with each passing moment. "My lady," Odessa said finally, straightening up and fixing Ilara with a serious, searching look. "May I ask how long this young man has been in your household?" "A few years now," Ilara answered. "He arrived before I did, actually. He was found wandering near the estate, unable to speak, badly injured. No one knew where he came from. Odessa nodded slowly, her expression growing more troubled by the moment. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Has he ever shown any unusual scarring? Perhaps something near his shoulder or upper back, in the shape of a flame surrounded by stars? Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen such a mark before, months ago, while helping Ash treat a minor injury, though she had never thought much of it beyond assuming it was simply an old scar, from whatever trauma had brought him to Millbrook in the first place. Yes, she whispered, I've seen it. Why does it matter? Odessa closed her eyes briefly, as though bracing herself for something significant. That mark, my lady, is not an ordinary scar. It is the royal birthmark, carried only by direct descendants of the ruling Alpha bloodline. Every heir to the throne bears that same symbol from birth. I saw it myself, years ago, on the young prince before he disappeared, when I served briefly at the royal court as a healer's apprentice. The room seemed to spin slightly around Ilara as the healer's words settled into place, confirming what she had already begun to suspect, but had not yet allowed herself to fully believe. Are you certain? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I cannot be entirely certain without further confirmation, Odessa said carefully, but between the mark, the ancient royal language he is currently speaking in his delirium, and the combat skills you described to me on my way here, I believe there is a very strong possibility that this young man is Prince Cale Ashworth, heir to the throne, believed lost or dead for the past 5 years. Ilara sank slowly onto a nearby stool, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind, that Ash's past might be more complicated than a simple stable-hand's history could explain. But hearing it confirmed so directly, hearing an actual name attached to the man she loved, a name that belonged to a missing prince, an heir to an entire kingdom, felt like an entirely different kind of reality altogether. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. That depends on many things, Odessa said gently, seeming to understand the emotional weight of what she had just revealed. If word of this reaches the capital, and if it is confirmed that this young man truly is the missing prince, then everything will change. The council currently ruling in his absence will need to relinquish power. Certain noble houses who have grown comfortable during his absence may not welcome his return, and he himself will face the enormous burden of reclaiming a throne and a life he cannot fully remember. Ilara looked over at Ash, still restless with fever, his handsome face pale and drawn with exhaustion, and felt a fierce, protective surge of love rise up within her chest. Whatever grand destiny might await him, whatever title or crown he might be entitled to, in this moment, he was simply the gentle, kind man she had come to love over the quiet months of their shared companionship, and she could not bear the thought of the wider world descending upon him before he was ready to face it. Please, she said to Odessa, can we keep this quiet for now? At least until he recovers, and we can speak with him properly about what he wants to do. Odessa considered the request for a long moment, before nodding slowly. I understand your concern, my lady, and I will honor your wish for discretion. But I must warn you, secrets of this magnitude rarely stay hidden for long, especially not when armed attackers have already come looking for something, or someone, at this very estate. I suspect those men who attacked your household were not simply common bandits. Someone may already suspect the truth, and if that is the case, more danger will surely follow. The warning settled heavily over Ilara as she resumed her vigil at Ash's bedside, tending to him through the following days, as his fever gradually broke and his strength slowly returned. She said nothing to him at first about what she and Odessa had discussed, wanting to give him time to heal fully before burdening him with the enormous revelation that awaited. When Ash finally regained full consciousness, several days after the fever first took hold, he seemed disoriented and exhausted, though his gray eyes brightened considerably when he saw Ilara sitting beside his bed, relief washing visibly across his features. You're awake, she said softly, taking his hand. You gave me quite a scare. He squeezed her hand weakly, offering her a tired but genuine smile, though something in his expression suggested he sensed a shift in the atmosphere around him, a heaviness that had not been present before his illness. Over the following week, as Ash regained his strength, Ilara found herself putting off the difficult conversation she knew they eventually needed to have. She busied herself instead with caring for him, bringing him meals, helping him with simple exercises to rebuild his strength, and maintaining the same warm, loving companionship they had always shared. But she could not avoid the truth forever, and she knew that keeping such an enormous secret from him, even temporarily, was not fair to either of them. Finally, one quiet evening as they sat together in his small room above the stable, the summer breeze drifting through an open window, Elara took a deep breath and gently broached the subject. "Ash," she said carefully, "while you were sick, you spoke. Actual words, not signs, not sketches, but spoken words, in a language none of us had ever heard before." Ash's expression shifted immediately, confusion, and something like fear crossing his features as he processed this information. He reached instinctively for his notebook, but Elara stopped him gently, taking both of his hands in hers instead. "Odessa, the healer who treated you, recognized the language. She said it was the ancient royal tongue, spoken only by the Alpha bloodline. And Ash, she also recognized the mark on your shoulder, the flame surrounded by stars. She believes, and I am beginning to believe as well, that you are not simply a stable hand who lost his way. She believes you are Prince Cale Ashworth, the missing heir to the throne, presumed dead for the past 5 years." The silence that followed felt endless, stretching taut between them, as Ash absorbed the weight of what she had just told him. His entire body went rigid, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and something that looked almost like painful recognition, as though some deeply buried part of him already knew this truth, even if his conscious mind had never been able to access it. Slowly he reached for his notebook, his hands trembling as he began to write, the words coming out shakier and more fragmented than usual, as though the very act of confronting this truth was physically difficult for him to bear. "I don't remember being a prince," the note read. "I don't remember a crown or a throne. I only remember fear, and running, and the fire. If what you're saying is true, then I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I can be that person again, even if I wanted to." Elara pulled him into a gentle embrace, holding him close as he trembled against her, the enormity of his hidden identity finally breaking through the careful walls he had built around himself over the years of silence and hiding. "You don't have to know who you are right this moment," she whispered against his hair. "We will figure this out together, one step at a time, just like we've figured out everything else. Whatever the truth turns out to be, I am not going anywhere, Ash. Or Cale. Whoever you are, I love you, and that will not change." They stayed wrapped in each other's arms for a long while, the quiet room offering a fragile sanctuary against the enormous, uncertain future now looming before them. Neither of them yet knew how quickly that future would arrive, or how completely it would upend the peaceful life they had so carefully built together at Millbrook. News of the discovery could not be contained for long, exactly as Odessa had warned. Within 2 weeks of Ash's recovery, a small envoy arrived at the Millbrook estate, its members bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Royal Council, the same flame and stars emblem that had once sent Ash into a panic on that quiet forest path. Elara watched from an upstairs window as 3 riders dismounted in the courtyard below, their expressions grave and purposeful as Greta hurried out to greet them. She felt her stomach twist with anxiety, uncertain whether this visit represented salvation or renewed danger for the man she loved. She found Ash in the stable, having insisted on returning to his regular duties, despite her gentle protests that he needed more time to rest. He looked up as she approached, immediately sensing her tension. "Riders have arrived," she said. "From the Royal Council, I believe." Odessa must have sent word after all, or perhaps someone else discovered the truth and reported it. Ash's hands stilled on the brush he had been using to groom one of the horses, his expression carefully neutral, though Elara could see the fear lurking just beneath the surface calm he was trying to project. Together, they made their way to the main house, where Alara's father, who had remained at the estate since the attack, was already speaking with the envoy's leader, an older man with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes that immediately fixed on Ash the moment he entered the room. "Prince Cale," the man said, bowing deeply, his voice carrying a formal reverence that made the title feel suddenly, undeniably real. "I am Commander Aldrich Fenwick, formerly of your father's royal guard. I served under him for nearly 20 years, and I have spent the last 5 searching tirelessly for you, never quite believing you were truly gone." Ash stiffened at the sound of his own name, spoken aloud with such certainty and formality, though he said nothing in response, his silence speaking volumes about the internal turmoil he was still working through. "He cannot speak," Alara said quickly, stepping slightly forward to explain on his behalf. "Not since whatever trauma he suffered during the attack that separated him from his family." Commander Fenwick's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "That does not surprise me, my lady. The night of the attack was chaos beyond anything I have witnessed before or since. Dark magic was used against the royal guard, powerful enough to shatter memories and steal voices entirely. I always suspected, if the young prince survived, he might carry such wounds." Over the following hour, Commander Fenwick explained everything he knew about the attack that had claimed the old king's life and scattered his son into hiding. A rival noble house, the Thornwood family, had orchestrated the assault, hoping to seize the throne for themselves by eliminating the entire royal bloodline in a single, coordinated strike. The attack had partially succeeded, killing the king and most of his guard, but the young prince had somehow escaped in the chaos, fleeing into the surrounding wilderness with the help of a few loyal guards who ultimately sacrificed their own lives to ensure his survival. "We searched for years," Fenwick continued, "but the dark magic used that night seemed to have concealed your trail almost completely, Your Highness. It was only recent rumors from this region, combined with reports of the attack on this very estate, that finally led us here. We believe the Thornwood family may have finally discovered your location as well, which explains the attackers who came for you weeks ago." Ash's hands trembled as he absorbed this information, and Alara reached for him instinctively, offering what comfort she could, as the full scope of his hidden past finally came into focus. He was not simply a prince who had been lost through misfortune. He was the sole surviving heir of a murdered king, hunted for years by the very people responsible for his father's death, his voice and memories stolen by dark magic in the chaos of that terrible night. "What happens now?" Alara asked, voicing the question that hung heavily over the entire room. "Now," Fenwick said gravely, "we must bring His Highness back to the capital, where loyalist forces can properly protect him, while we confirm his identity beyond any doubt, and begin the process of restoring him to his rightful place on the throne. The Thornwood family has grown increasingly bold in recent months, and if they suspect we have found him, they may attempt another, more decisive strike, before we can secure his safety." Ash looked toward Alara, his gray eyes filled with a desperate uncertainty that broke her heart. She understood, without him needing to sign a single word, that he was terrified, not of the danger itself, but of the enormous responsibility now being placed upon his shoulders, a crown and a kingdom he could not fully remember, a legacy he had never asked for and was not certain he could carry. "I will go with him," Alara said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Wherever he goes, I intend to be there as well." Commander Fenwick studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the depth of devotion behind her words, before nodding slowly. "That can certainly be arranged, my lady, assuming His Highness wishes it as well." Ash nodded immediately, reaching for Alara's hand and holding it tightly, as though the thought of facing this overwhelming transition without her by his side was simply unbearable. The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Commander Fenwick's guards secured the estate against any further attacks while arrangements were made for the journey back to the capital. Alara's father, initially stunned by the revelation of Ash's true identity, quickly recovered his composure and began treating the situation with the careful political calculation that had defined his approach to life in the capital, though Alara noticed a new warmth in how he now regarded the man who had once simply been her family's stable hand. Throughout the preparations, Ash remained quiet and withdrawn, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his entire existence. Alara made a point of staying close to him during these difficult days, offering steady reassurance whenever his anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, reminding him gently that he did not need to have all the answers immediately, that they would face whatever came next together, exactly as they had faced every challenge since the day they first met in that quiet stable. On the night before their departure for the capital, Ash led Alara out to their familiar bench beside the stable, the same spot where they had shared countless quiet breakfasts and evening conversations over the past years. He seemed nervous, more so than she had seen him since his initial recovery from the fever, and she waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts, his hands moving slowly through the signs they had developed together so long ago. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he signed, "and whatever I become once we reach the capital, I need you to know something. You saved me long before anyone discovered who I truly was. You gave me a name when I had none. You taught me to speak again, even if only with my hands. Whatever crown I might wear, you will always be the reason I found my way back to myself." Tears filled Ilara's eyes as she watched his hands move through this heartfelt declaration, and she reached out to cup his face gently in her palms. "And you gave me a reason to believe in kindness again," she said softly, "after everyone in the capital taught me to expect only cruelty. Whatever crowns awaits you, Ash, I will be right there beside you, exactly as I promised." He leaned forward and kissed her then, softly and tenderly, a silent promise of devotion that needed no words to convey its depth. They remained together beneath the stars for a long while afterward, drawing strength from each other, in preparation for the uncertain, enormous journey that awaited them both come morning. As dawn broke over Millbrook the following day, the small procession prepared to depart for the capital, Commander Fenwick's guards forming a protective escort around the carriage that would carry Ash and Ilara toward a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met in that quiet stable years ago. Ilara took one last look back at the estate that had become her sanctuary, grateful for the peaceful years it had given them, even as she felt the pull of the larger, more dangerous world now awaiting them both. Beside her, Ash reached for her hand, his grip steady despite the uncertainty ahead, and together they set off toward the capital, ready to face whatever challenges and dangers still lay before them, united by a love that had grown strong enough to weather any storm the wider world might send their way. The journey to the capital took nearly a week, the small procession moving cautiously along back roads and lesser-traveled paths to avoid any potential ambush from Thornwood loyalists who might still be searching for the prince. Commander Fenwick maintained a constant, watchful vigilance throughout the journey, his guards rotating in careful patterns to ensure no threat could approach unnoticed. Ilara spent much of the journey by Ash's side, watching as he grew increasingly quiet and contemplative the closer they drew to the capital, the weight of his impending role settling more heavily onto his shoulders with each passing mile. She did her best to offer comfort where she could, though she understood there was little she could say to fully ease the enormous burden he now carried. On the 5th day of travel, as they passed through a small village, an unexpected encounter tested their resolve. A group of merchants recognized the royal insignia on Commander Fenwick's guards and began spreading word through the village that the missing prince had finally been found. By the time their procession reached the village square, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and hope, eager for a glimpse of the man who might finally restore stability to a kingdom that had drifted for years under the council's uncertain rule. Ash tensed visibly as the carriage slowed, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention, but Commander Fenwick gently encouraged him to acknowledge the gathered crowd, explaining that the people deserved reassurance after years of uncertainty about their missing prince. With Ilara's steady hand resting on his arm for support, Ash stepped down from the carriage and faced the crowd, his silence immediately noticeable, but somehow not diminishing the quiet dignity he carried himself with. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd began to weep, murmuring prayers of gratitude, while children peered curiously from behind their parents' legs, sensing the significance of the moment even if they did not fully understand it. Ash raised his hand in a simple, humble gesture of acknowledgement, and though he could not offer them words, the genuine warmth in his expression seemed to communicate everything necessary. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, and Ilara felt a swell of pride watching him navigate this unexpected moment with such quiet grace, despite his obvious discomfort with the sudden public attention. As they continued their journey afterward, Ash seemed lost in thought, his expression thoughtful rather than distressed, and Ilara sensed that the encounter, however overwhelming, had also offered him something valuable, a glimpse of the genuine hope and goodwill his people still held for him, despite the years of his absence. They finally arrived at the outskirts of the capital on the 7th day, the enormous stone walls and towering spires of the royal city rising imposingly against the horizon. Ilara had grown up in this city, had attended countless ceremonies within its grand halls, and yet returning now, under such dramatically different circumstances, made the familiar sight feel entirely new and unfamiliar. Commander Fenwick led them not to the main palace, which remained under contested control between the council and Thornwood sympathizers, but to a secure loyalist stronghold on the outskirts of the city, where trusted nobles who had never abandoned hope for the prince's return had gathered to verify his identity and plan the delicate process of reclaiming the throne. The verification process took several days, involving careful examination of Ash's birthmark by royal healers, comparison of his features against old portraits and detailed physical descriptions provided by those who had known him as a child, and extensive questioning designed to draw out any surviving memories that might confirm his identity beyond reasonable doubt. Throughout this intense scrutiny, Elara remained a steady, constant presence at Ash's side, offering quiet reassurance whenever the process grew particularly difficult or emotionally taxing. She watched him struggle through fragmented, painful attempts to recall details of his childhood, small memories occasionally surfacing amid the fog that still obscured much of his past. A favorite childhood pet, the sound of his mother's laughter, before she had passed away when he was young, brief flashes of his father teaching him to ride a horse in the royal stables. Each surfaced memory seemed to steady him slightly, filling in small pieces of the identity that had been so violently stolen from him years earlier, though his voice remained stubbornly silent throughout the entire process. The trauma of that terrible night, apparently too deeply rooted to be resolved through memory alone. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of careful verification, the Loyalist Council declared with full confidence that Ash was indeed Prince Cale Ashworth, rightful heir to the throne, and began the delicate process of preparing to challenge the current ruling council and the ambitious Thornwood family for control of the kingdom. This process proved far more complicated and dangerous than Elara had anticipated. The Thornwood family, upon learning that the prince had indeed been found and confirmed, launched an aggressive campaign to discredit the identification, spreading rumors throughout the capital that the man being presented was merely an impostor, cleverly trained to imitate royal mannerisms in an elaborate scheme to seize power illegitimately. Tensions within the capital grew increasingly volatile as Loyalist and Thornwood factions clashed in the streets, each side attempting to sway public opinion through increasingly desperate measures. Elara watched with growing anxiety as Ash bore the weight of this political struggle, his silent nature making him an easy target for Thornwood propaganda, which painted his inability to speak as evidence of deception rather than trauma. During this tense period, an unexpected attempt was made on Ash's life within the very stronghold meant to protect him. A servant, secretly loyal to the Thornwood family, attempted to poison his evening meal, though the plot was discovered just in time by an alert guard who noticed something suspicious about the servant's behavior. The incident shook everyone within the Loyalist stronghold, highlighting just how far the Thornwood family was willing to go to prevent Ash from reclaiming his rightful place. Commander Fenwick doubled security measures immediately, but the attempt underscored the precarious nature of their entire situation, the constant danger lurking just beneath the surface of their careful political maneuvering. Through all of this chaos and danger, Elara remained resolutely by Ash's side, her presence offering him a small measure of stability amid the overwhelming uncertainty surrounding his future. She helped him prepare for difficult meetings with skeptical nobles, stood beside him during tense negotiations, and offered quiet comfort during the rare private moments they managed to steal amid the relentless demands of his emerging role. One evening, as they sat together in the modest quarters they had been given within the stronghold, Ash reached for his notebook, his expression heavy with exhaustion and doubt. "I don't know if I can do this," he wrote, his hand trembling slightly. "Everyone expects me to lead a kingdom, to make decisions that affect thousands of lives, and I cannot even speak to reassure them. How can I possibly convince an entire nation to trust someone who cannot even offer them his voice?" Elara took his hand gently, understanding the depth of his fear and self-doubt. "Your voice was taken from you, through no fault of your own," she said firmly. "But that does not mean you have nothing to offer your people. You have shown me, time and again, that true strength comes not from grand speeches, but from patience, kindness, and quiet determination. You saved an entire household from armed attackers without hesitation. You cared for wounded animals with more compassion than most people show to each other. Your silence does not diminish your worth as a leader, Ash. If anything, it has taught you to listen more carefully than most people ever learn to do." Ash looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude, and though he still could not voice his response, the way he pulled her close and rested his forehead against hers communicated everything necessary. Slowly, over the following days, buoyed by her unwavering support, he began approaching his emerging role with renewed confidence, finding ways to lead through action and presence rather than relying solely on spoken words, earning the growing respect of loyalist nobles who came to recognize the genuine strength and integrity behind his quiet demeanor. As the political struggle between Loyalist and Thornwood factions continued to intensify, it became increasingly clear that the conflict would need to be resolved through more decisive means, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ultimately determine not just Ash's future, but the future of the entire kingdom. The resolution, when it finally came, arrived not through open conflict but through a carefully orchestrated gathering of the kingdom's most influential nobles, arranged by Commander Fenwick and the Loyalist Council, to settle the succession dispute once and for all, before it could spiral into wider unrest. The Thornwood family, confident in their years of consolidated influence over the ruling council, agreed to attend, believing they could still sway enough support to discredit Ash's claim, or at the very least, delay his coronation long enough to negotiate a compromise that preserved their considerable power. Alara stood at the back of the grand hall on the morning of the gathering, watching as nobles from every corner of the kingdom filed into the same ornate chamber where, years earlier and in an entirely different capital hall, she herself had once been publicly humiliated and cast aside. The symmetry of returning to a space so similar, though under such different circumstances, was not lost on her. Ash stood at the front of the hall, dressed in formal attire that marked him unmistakably as royalty, his posture steady, despite the obvious weight of the moment pressing down upon him. Alara had helped him prepare that morning, straightening his collar and offering quiet words of encouragement, reminding him that whatever happened in this hall, she believed completely in his ability to lead with wisdom and compassion, even without his voice. Lord Thornwood, a sharp-featured man with cold, calculating eyes, rose first to address the assembled nobles, questioning once again the validity of Ash's identification, suggesting that a prince incapable of speech could never adequately represent the kingdom's interests on the world stage. The hall fell into tense silence as all eyes turned toward Ash, waiting to see how he might respond to such a direct challenge. Rather than retreating into uncertainty, Ash stepped forward calmly, and using the formal hand signs Alara had helped him develop and refine over recent weeks, specifically for moments such as this, he began to communicate directly with the assembled nobles, his gestures translated aloud by Commander Fenwick, who had taken the time to learn the signs specifically for this purpose. "My silence was stolen from me the same night my father was murdered," Ash signed, Fenwick's voice carrying the words clearly across the hall. "I do not apologize for a wound inflicted upon me through violence I did not choose. I ask instead that you judge me by my actions, by the years I spent hiding, not because I lacked courage, but because I lacked memory of who I truly was. I ask you to judge me by how I have conducted myself since regaining that knowledge, by the loyalty I have shown to those who protected me, and by the compassion I have tried to show to everyone I have encountered along this difficult journey." The hall remained silent for a long moment after Fenwick finished translating, the weight of Ash's words settling heavily over the assembled nobles. Then, unexpectedly, an elderly noblewoman near the front of the hall rose to her feet, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I served your father for 30 years, Your Highness," she said, addressing Ash directly, "and I see in you the same quiet strength and genuine care for this kingdom's people that defined his reign. A voice is not the only measure of a worthy leader. Sometimes, silence carries more wisdom than empty words ever could." Her declaration seemed to shift something within the room, other nobles nodding in agreement, murmuring their own support, as the tide of opinion visibly turned in Ash's favor. Lord Thornwood, sensing his position rapidly eroding, attempted one final gambit, producing documents he claimed proved discrepancies in Ash's identification. However, Commander Fenwick had anticipated exactly this kind of desperate maneuver, and quickly presented counter-evidence, testimony from surviving guards who had witnessed the original attack, detailed medical documentation from the royal healers who had confirmed Ash's birthmark, and physical characteristics beyond any reasonable doubt, and finally, damning evidence linking the Thornwood family directly to the assassination attempt that had claimed the old king's life 5 years earlier. Faced with such overwhelming evidence, Lord Thornwood's support among the assembled nobles collapsed entirely, and within hours, the Loyalist Council formally recognized Ash as the rightful heir to the throne, setting a date for his official coronation just 2 weeks hence. The Thornwood family, stripped of their political influence and facing serious charges related to the assassination plot, quietly withdrew from the capital, their decades of ambition finally and completely undone. The following 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation, the entire capital coming alive with anticipation for the coronation of their long-lost prince. Ilara found herself swept up in the preparations as well, though her role remained somewhat uncertain, caught between her status as a disgraced noblewoman and her position as the prince's closest companion and confidant. It was Ash himself who resolved this uncertainty, calling a private meeting with the Loyalist Council just days before his coronation. Ilara was summoned to attend as well, uncertain what to expect as she took her place in the modest council chamber. "I have made my decision regarding my future queen," Ash signed, Commander Fenwick translating as always, though his voice carried an unmistakable note of pride and joy that had not been present in earlier, more difficult negotiations. "I choose Lady Ilara Vance, who cared for me when I was nothing more than a voiceless stable hand, who taught me to communicate again after years of silence, who stood beside me through every danger and uncertainty this journey has presented, and who loved me, not for any crown or title, but for who I am as a person." Ilara felt tears spring to her eyes, as the assembled council members turned to look at her, several offering warm, approving smiles. She had expected resistance, perhaps even scandal, given her own history of public rejection years earlier, but instead, she found only genuine acceptance and support. The very same court that had once discarded her, now welcoming her with open arms as their future queen. On the day of the coronation, the grand hall overflowed with nobles, dignitaries, and common citizens alike, all gathered to witness the historic restoration of their rightful king. Ilara stood near the front of the assembly, dressed in a gown of deep blue, watching with overwhelming pride and love as Ash knelt before the assembled crowd to receive the crown that had waited 5 long years for his return. As the crown settled upon his head, the hall erupted into thunderous applause and cheering, the collective relief and joy of an entire kingdom finally released after years of uncertainty and political turmoil. Ash rose to his feet as King Cale Ashworth, his gray eyes immediately seeking out Ilara in the crowd, finding her gaze, and holding it with a warmth that spoke more powerfully than any words ever could. Following the formal coronation ceremony, in a private moment away from the public celebration, Ash led Ilara to a quiet balcony overlooking the same city that had once cast her aside and now celebrated her return as their future queen. He turned to face her, his expression suddenly nervous, despite the confidence he had displayed throughout the day's momentous events. Slowly, carefully, he opened his mouth, and for the first time since the night of his father's assassination, actual words emerged, quiet and rough from years of disuse, but unmistakably real. "Ilara," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "thank you for giving me back everything I thought I had lost forever." Ilara gasped, tears streaming freely down her face, as she heard his voice for the very first time, the sound more beautiful to her than any music she had ever known. "You spoke," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face gently. "Ash, you spoke. Only for you," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word, years of buried words finally finding their way free. "You gave me my voice back, Ilara, in every way that truly matters. You saw me when I was nothing more than a silent stranger hiding in a stable, and you loved me anyway, long before you ever knew I was a king." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring, kneeling before her on the quiet balcony as the sounds of celebration continued to drift up from the city below. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "and rule this kingdom by my side, not because destiny demanded it, but because I choose you, above any crown or title this world could ever offer me." Ilara sank to her knees before him, taking his face in her hands, her own voice thick with tears as she answered, "Yes, Ash. 1,000 times yes. I loved you when you had no name, no voice, and no crown, and I will love you exactly the same way for the rest of our lives together." As he slid the ring onto her finger, the setting sun cast golden light across the capital city, illuminating a kingdom finally at peace after years of uncertainty, and 2 hearts that had found in each other exactly what they had both been searching for all along. The Omega once rejected in front of an entire court, and the silent king once hidden in a humble stable, stood together on that quiet balcony, no longer broken or discarded, but whole, beloved, and finally, completely home.